Well, thank you so much, Bruno, for that very kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for hosting us today. I'm delighted to be here with all my Columbia colleagues. One reason I'm especially happy to be presenting this paper to this group is this is my first attempt at comparative work. So as was mentioned earlier, my name is Robert Jackson. At Columbia, I typically do work on US corporate governance, both on policy debates and empirical analysis of executive compensation. But this is my very first try at looking at a series of governance questions in a country other than my own. As you'll see, this is co-authored work with a guy you know, Professor Milhaupt. And this is one of the occupational hazards of working at Columbia. If you're down the hall from Curtis, you're basically not going to get through the first few years without writing something about Japan. And this is a bit of a selfish project for me because in this project, I really learned more than I contributed to the paper. So the reason I'm interested in presenting it here is to hear a little bit about what we might say about our findings that would be interesting to a comparative audience. That's why I'm so glad Mariana is going to offer her comments. I'll try to be brief because I want to get as many of your questions as possible. Let me just give a quick overview of the paper, then I'll describe our findings, and I'll be happy to have your comments and questions. So what we do in this paper is we use the first ever direct evidence on how the top executives of Japanese companies are paid to take the first sort of empirical look at governance questions in Japan. Now, I should clarify that there have been papers before that have tried to study executive compensation in Japan, some peer-reviewed work from 20 to 25 years ago. But in Japan, until recently, it wasn't known exactly how or how much top executives were paid. Instead, the disclosure rules only provided the average of what the entire board of directors was paid. I mention that point because another reason that I think this might be an interesting paper for this audience is that you might know in 2010 the Brazilian CVM mandated executive compensation disclosure for Brazilian public companies. So this is a debate that's happening in Brazil as well. I have some thoughts about those disclosure rules too, but for present purposes what I want to tell you is that recently Japan in 2010 changed its rules to require individual disclosure of compensation for executives, and those are the rules we use to get the data that we use in this study. Now, the first thing I want to say is, in general, one thing we've seen in global corporate governance is some convergence toward practices that have been informed by the American experience. So, the American experience in corporate governance is with a very specific type of company. Yeah? It's a company that has dispersed owners. Yeah? This is the Burl and Means model that Curtis alluded to earlier. And this kind of corporate ownership is subject to a familiar problem. It's nice for lots of reasons, diversification, et cetera, but it has a problem, which is that passive shareholders might be taken advantage of by directors who have interests different from their own. And all of American corporate governance debates for the last 10 or 20 years have been focused on how to resolve that problem. Yeah? So US corporate governance, things like having independent directors who are separate from management, giving shareholders more power, these are all things that are driven by our concern that our governance model, the ownership structure in the US, leads to this agency problem that we have to resolve. Yeah? The trouble is that the convergence in practices internationally, the use of these practices overseas, is interesting because not all ownership structures look like the American ownership structure. In fact, to the contrary, most don't, including Japan, Brazil, and other countries that are interesting. So when I see these governance reforms adopted in countries that don't have our ownership structure, I wonder, why is that good? And that's one of the things I hope to debate with you today. Now, as I said earlier, Japanese regulators have recently said that public company executives in Japan have to disclose how they're paid. And what we do in this paper is use that information to try and find out a little bit about how Japanese executives are generally paid. And they also let us look at two things. First of all, they let us look at the relationship between the governance structure of the company and how the executive is paid. That is, the types of directors they have, does that tell us anything about how their executives get paid, first? And second, what other interesting things can we see about how executives are paid? What drives how much and how Japanese executives are paid, and I'll share a little of those findings with you as well. So some background that's important to know about Japan is, and the way their corporations are governed, is that there's a traditional corporate governance structure that has prevailed in the majority of Japanese companies for many years, and it's sometimes referred to as a statutory auditor structure. It's a bit of an unusual structure for someone coming from my background, and there are a couple of important things to let you know about it. In a statutory auditor structure, as we explain in the paper, the shareholders of the company elect the board of directors and elect a board of statutory auditors whose formal charge is to make sure the board of directors and the management of the company obey the law. The thing to know is that this board of auditors has historically been a rather weak governance organ. It doesn't exercise close oversight over the board of directors, and in this structure, the board of directors need not include an independent director. Or need not include a majority of independent directors. So this traditional structure is typically associated with relatively weak, lax governance oversight. That is to say, the managers tend to have discretion in the decisions that they make. Now, a few years ago, the Japanese government gave companies in Japan another option for governing their company. They could choose to stay with the traditional approach, the statutory auditor approach, or they could choose what we refer to in the paper, and is referred to in other work, as companies with committees. This is a more traditional, typical American structure. Yeah? Those of you who've looked at American companies will be familiar with this approach. Basically, in this structure, the shareholders elect the board of directors. The board of directors then chooses committees that oversee negotiations with management. These committees must have a majority of independent directors, just like committees must in the United States, and they oversee discussions with management. Critically, for our purposes, there's a compensation committee made up of independent directors who bargain over executive pay with top managers. So Japanese law gives companies these two choices, and in this paper, we're able to use the different choices that the companies make as to their governance and see if there's a relationship with having this structure versus this structure and the way top executives are paid. So far, so good? Okay, fantastic. So what we do is we use these newly required disclosures, this brand new law that requires disclosure of executive compensation, to find out how executives are paid in Japan. So what we do is the rule in Japan, the rule they adopted, is any manager who earned more than 100 million yen in 2010 has to disclose the details of their pay. There were 152 such firms in Japan in 2010, and what we did with the help of some intrepid research assistants was draw from these disclosures individual detail on how much each executive is paid, how they're paid in bonuses, stock options, etc., the amount of stock ownership the executives have, their age, how long they've been on the board of directors, and using biographical information, we can see whether the executive is a non-Japanese executive or is a native Japanese executive. We can also see whether the executive founded the company, which turns out to be important with respect to their executive compensations. We find these 152 firms that have managers where we have pay information, and then we draw from the annual report additional information on, for example, their governance structure, whether or not they use the traditional method or the companies with committees. We also draw detail on their industry, on firm value, and the like, and we use these as controls in our analysis. So what do we find? Well, first we get data on 269 individual Japanese executives, and we find some things that are generally consistent with the previous literature and presumptions about executives in Japan. That is, they tend to be on the board of directors for relatively long periods of time, for example. The average executive in our sample has been on the board for 16 years. That's a very, very long tenure for an executive, at least compared to the United States. The average pay, so the dollar to yen is about 100 to 1, so the average pay is something like just over $1 million. This suggests, and we hint in the paper, although we don't do comprehensive comparative analysis, that Japanese executives are paid less than American executives, even controlling for differences in the firms. They make a lot of their money in salary as opposed to bonus, so they have fixed payments. And this is generally consistent with the traditional understanding of the way Japanese executives are paid, which is they're paid relatively low amounts, but they get long tenure. That is, they get to stay on the firm for long periods of time. It's consistent with some cultural intuitions, too, I think, that becoming a senior executive at a Japanese firm is a reward for a lifetime of work, and one gets lengthy tenure as compensation for their work for the company. So at a summary level, the data kind of confirms what we already knew about executive pay in Japan. But then what we do in the paper is we separate out the firms that have the traditional statutory auditor structure from those that have the committee structure. That's more familiar to US governance. And we immediately begin to see some interesting differences in the companies. By the way, when I have these asterisks here, all I'm doing is showing you that the differences between the two numbers are statistically significant. That is that a test of how similar these two numbers are suggests that the difference is unlikely to be random. That's all I mean there. So for example, companies with committees are very likely to be international firms. They're likely to have a high level of their sales coming from outside Japan. They're likely to have many more foreign shareholders, for example. The executives are likely to have shorter tenure. That is, the average executive in a company with committee is only likely to have been on the board for 11 years, which is a relatively short tenure compared to the statutory auditor average of more than 20 years. So even though you see some differences in the types of companies, one thing that's interesting and consistent with a previous paper Professor Milhaupt did with my other colleague Ron Gilson, you don't see a significant difference in firm value. This is a measure known as Tobin's Q that econometrics folks in the US use to separate out firm value to try and figure out what the differences are in firm value. And I don't see a statistically meaningful difference between the two groups in that way, but instead I see different characteristics that might drive governance aspects. And so seeing these two different characteristics, we thought, let's look at how these two different board structures pay executives differently in Japan. And one thing you see immediately that's very interesting is the standard story, which is that Japanese executives don't get paid for performance, but instead get fixed pay at low levels over time, is true in traditionally governed companies, but much less true in companies that use the new structure. So what I'm showing you here is the percentage of their pay that comes in different forms: salary, bonus, stock options, etc. And what I'm showing you here is that on average, the executives who work at companies with committees get much more of their pay in performance-sensitive types, like, for example, bonuses or stock options, as compared to their colleagues at statutory auditor companies, the traditionally governed companies, who get much more of their pay in the form of salary. So this traditional story holds at companies that are traditionally governed, but at the companies that are adopting the new governance structure, you see more pay for performance than you do at statutory auditor firms. Something else that's interesting at the companies that are governed by committees versus those who are governed at statutory auditor companies is the relationship between executive pay and firm size. So in the US, one of the shibboleths of executive compensation work is that as firm size rises, so must executive pay. By the way, this is not necessarily a troubling conclusion. You can make an argument that that's the optimal state of affairs, that the bigger the company, the more we want to reward the people who run it, etc. And what we did was we tried to test executive pay as it relates to firm size, separating out by the companies with committees versus the companies with traditional governance. And here we had an interesting finding. This idea that the amount of pay rises with firm size is very true at companies with committees. So the average executive at a company with committee, when it's in the bottom 3 quartiles of firm size, so it's one of the smaller companies, makes 140 million yen a year. And if you look at the companies in the top quartile, the average person makes 198 million yen. And this is a statistically significant difference. So as the firm size increases, so does the executive's pay in companies with committees. So again, the standard US lesson applies in the companies that have adopted the US structure. Let's now look at the companies that have adopted that stay with the traditional structure, the statutory auditor structure. In the smaller firms, the average executive earns about 171 million yen. But in a larger firm, you'd expect this to increase, but no, actually. That's wrong. That should be 154 million. In the smaller companies, the executives earn 154 million yen. And in fact, if I show you in a more extensive regression analysis included in the appendix, which I'm happy to show you in the slides if you like, you'll see that this relationship actually doesn't obtain at all statistically for companies with statutory auditors. What this means is that the increase of executive pay with firm size is true in the companies with committees, but not in the traditionally governed companies, which is a very striking finding for someone who's used to studying executive pay in the United States. Similarly, we can look at another kind of signal of governance quality that's typical in the US literature, which is the gap between the highest paid executive of the company and the average executive's pay in the company. It's thought in the United States that the gap between the top executive and in other companies, and the average executive in the company should increase with firm size. And in fact, in companies with committees, we see that as well. So this is the average gap, the difference between the highest paid executive and the average executive in the company. Again, in the US, this is thought to increase with firm size. Again, why? Because as firm size increases, it's thought that the CEO, the top paid individual, has the most important influence. And in fact, the data show that as you go from smaller firms to larger firms, this gap increases in a statistically meaningful way in companies with committees. In the more traditionally governed firms, you see the opposite relationship, actually. In the more traditionally governed firms, in the smaller companies, there's a gap between the executives and the top executive and the median executive. But in the larger companies, it's actually a smaller gap. And one intuition that this kind of is consistent with is in Japanese companies, there's some upper bound where in traditionally governed firms, the top executive, for some reason, whether it's cultural or governance related in a traditionally governed firm, simply will not want to go a significant distance above the pay of her colleagues. It's just an interesting comparative difference that you don't typically see in the US boardroom, but that is clear from the Japanese data. So I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about the relationship between the governance choice and the pay outcomes I just described. But before I do, I want to add two other interesting findings we can discuss a bit. We looked in the data for other things that are important to how much Japanese executives get paid or how they get paid. And one thing we found that was extremely robust in the data is it matters whether or not the executive is Japanese, is native Japanese or not. If you're a non-Japanese executive, you earn about 50 to 60% more in total pay than your Japanese colleagues, controlling for all kinds of differences in firms and performance. And you receive a much higher proportion of your pay in the form of stock options. And as I say, in regressions in the appendices, I control for all kinds of differences in firms. I'd be happy to talk about the technical stuff if you'd like. But what's interesting about this, we think, is that for non-Japanese executives, international markets and executive pay seem to be influencing the pay bargain. That is, to convince one of these folks to run a Japanese company, you have to pay more, and you've got to give them more upside in the company's value than you might for a Japanese executive. So that's another sort of interesting determinant we found of executive pay. And then finally, something that's fascinating, and previously, as far as I know, not studied at all in Japan, is that half of our sample of folks who earn more than 100 million yen in Japanese companies are made up of founders of the firm. The reason that's interesting is that in the United States, when I look at the pay for performance connection, we look at things like bonuses and options, that all matters, et cetera. But we really care about stock ownership. And the reason is that that's the contract stock ownership that leads to the most close link between pay and performance, traditionally, according to the US literature. What's important about this finding is that many Japanese executives who are among the highest paid are founders and therefore own a significant proportion of the company's stock. This is an unheard of number, 10% ownership in the company's stock for a large public company in the United States, but it's actually rather common in Japan. The folks who have argued in the past that Japanese managers don't have a strong pay performance link weren't aware of this number, because this ownership of the founder of the company creates a very strong connection between pay and performance in Japan that hasn't been previously noticed. Okay, so four very quick points to conclude. First, I think what the paper tells us, or what these data tell us for the first time, is that there's an important relationship between the governance structure you choose and the executive pay you choose. If you choose a US-type governance structure, you're more likely to get a US-style pay-performance relationship. And query, following up on Jed's point earlier, whether that's good. We wonder in the paper whether it's a good idea, for example, to adopt a US-style board structure and performance-sensitive pay. It's not obvious that it would be. Why? Because if you have an independent board, you might already have close managerial oversight. Yeah? That is, these two things might be complements. You might not need to have both of these tools in the company at the same time. Now, maybe you should have both these things in the company at the same time, but theoretically, that's not obvious. And a concern you might have with these findings is that companies that are beginning to adopt these US structures are adopting them all at once. That is, if you adopt the board structure with the committees, you get stock options and high bonuses, et cetera. And it's not clear you want all those things in the firm at the same time. Second, this paper is very preliminary, so it's our first look at the data. Really, all we're trying to do is describe what we see, a little analysis on the margins, but there are lots of reasons why you might see the connection we do between the governance structure and pay. It could be indigeneity, although we do our best to control for that. It could be that companies are signaling. That is, it's not really meaningful on the margin, but I signal that I have a US-style pay structure, and I signal that I have an independent committee, and that's important to investors. Or it could be causation. It could be that the independent directors bargain harder over pay, and therefore they get a different pay package. All those things can't be, those causation explanations can't be ruled out by our data, and further work's needed to do that. Also, Japanese investors, executives, regulators, everyone should notice the huge differences between the pay for non-Japanese and Japanese executives, very significant differences, and also the presence of founders in the Japanese public company economy, which has not been noticed. And then finally, and we say this in our paper, you know, the idea of choosing a disclosure regime based on who makes more than 100 million yen, not clear to me that that's the best design. Now, there are arguments on both sides. Maybe that's not the US approach. It doesn't follow it's not the best approach. We explain in the paper that the way it was arrived at in Japan is a little hazy and not totally obvious. One problem with this approach is that it gives researchers like us sample bias problems because we only see people who make more than 100 million yen. We try and deal with that in the paper. I can say more about that in the Q&A. But the thing to see is that regulators who are designing these regimes, like in Brazil, should be thinking about how investors and researchers can use the data. Yeah? And that design choice in Japan wasn't made in a way that's so helpful to either investors or to researchers. And we suggest in the paper ways that these disclosure regimes can be improved to allow further research in the area. So that's the paper. Marianne, I'm happy to have your comments.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to start anyway. So thanks, Rob and Curtis, for a really interesting paper. I think as Rob mentioned, it really resonates with our current reality in Brazil, which is some type of people ask me, well, is executive compensation a huge issue in Brazil? And probably not yet, because a huge problem is that we don't have enough data, and the reason why we don't have enough data is not, in Brazil, clearly it's not accidental, it's political. CVM tried to create US-style regulations imposing individualized disclosure of executive compensation. Executives went crazy about it. They lobbied it during the public hearing process. They banned it, and for some of them, are still fighting those regulations in court. And so far, they have succeeded. But I'll say more about that. I won't spend much of your time just restating in much worse terms what Rob has just said. I mean, this is a really interesting project. They really try to take advantage of this new information that's out there and try to understand more about executive pay practices in Japan. And I really like also the spirit of the paper and their policy implications, which is basically we need to know more about what's going on before deriving very detailed policy implications. Of course, they have limitations, and that's due to the regulators, but I think the project is really worthwhile, and it also raises really interesting questions. One important policy implication that they raise, and that's a traditional one, but very important one for comparative law scholars, is that you really should be careful about the unintended consequences of importing US corporate governance practices or other countries' corporate governance practices without taking, of course, the underlying economic reality into account. So basically, there are some points I was just very, very curious about, and maybe that's not the place to elaborate on them, but I thought it was very interesting that Japanese managers earn less, and also their compensation is less performance-based than non-Japanese managers. And I think that raises important questions for future work. I mean, it could be something trivial, perhaps. Maybe it's just an expatriate premium. People don't want to live in Japan, so perhaps they're really, those executives are especially suited to those companies, and people don't want to live in Japan, so you have to pay them more to go live in Japan. So that's perhaps trivial. You have expatriate premiums in other contexts as well. But it could be something deeper, and in that sense, really interesting if it's a cultural based explanation. It's just not acceptable in the Japanese society for a Japanese manager to earn more. The one question that really bugged me in that regard during the paper, and perhaps it's in there, but I couldn't really identify it that clearly, is whether foreign nationality could be a proxy for an outside hire. In the US, I mean, it's ridiculous for me to describe the literature on executive compensation to both of you, but of course there is some literature suggesting that actually outside hires are paid more, and their paid is more sensitive to performance, which is exactly what we see here with respect to non-Japanese managers. So is that maybe the omitted variable here? Maybe there's just outside hires, and that's what's driving the result, and not some very interesting cultural explanation. So I mentioned here, you have lots of controls. I mentioned the issue of inside versus outside hire of the executive. You mentioned tenure, I am aware, but it might not be exactly the same thing. And of course, one issue that is really interesting and a key one in the corporate governance and executive pay literature is the relationship with ownership structures. I mean, even, of course, you know that. Milhaupt mentions that in his other paper. And that's almost completely absent from the paper, not completely. You mentioned foreign investors in the committee-based firms and also founders. But other than that, we don't have that much detail. Perhaps that's because they're all widely held. You perhaps hinted at that during the presentation, but that would be interesting to know, or if we don't know, perhaps to acknowledge. And one thing that really, but really, I think the main maybe implicit implication of the paper is that there is a link between the board structure and executive pay, and here I just raised the question, well, maybe we saw that in the US historically as well. Of course, you used to have no or fewer independent directors. We had lower pay and we had greater tenure. So perhaps, I mean, you also have another data point showing this connection now with your neat Japanese case. With respect to comparison to Brazil, well, of course, Japan is very different from Brazil, and actually couldn't be more different according to the study, which Zohar doesn't like, which is a study that estimates the private benefits of control in many countries based on the control premium in a sale of control transactions, and basically based on that, the implication would be that Brazil has very low levels of investor protection, and Japan, amazingly, has incredibly high levels of investor protection, so no one wants to control the firm. I mean, from this, that's what your interpretation would be from this data. So Brazil and Japan are very, very different, but they are similar in that there's still no individualized mandate on compensation disclosure. I mentioned the political dynamics before. I mean, the lobby was very clear, and it's really interesting that courts have sided with the executive so far. And this is very interesting because although I really appreciate the message and the discourse of this paper, which is, well, we have to be very careful about foreign transplants because different underlying situations require different legal institutions. That can also be used in a very opportunistic way, which is, I think, the way this was used in Brazilian courts. Brazilian courts says, well, hang on, we know other countries have individualized compensation disclosure, but Brazil is different. Why? Because Brazil is violent, so you could get kidnapped. I mean, this was really the argument. Therefore, those CVM regulations, they're unconstitutional, both because they are a violation to the executive's right to privacy and also a violation of the executive's right to personal security. It turns out that was very opportunistic because later I found out that also in the US, when they tried to introduce this first mandates a long time ago, they also said kidnaps, you know that kidnappings are an important risk. But so far,
just a footnote there. The same argument was made in Japan by Japanese.
Oh, also, okay. But in Brazil, it is slightly more credible, perhaps. I mean, Brazil is a violent country, although clearly it's no secret that top executives in large firms make a whole lot more than the average Brazilian, and we know their names, we know sometimes their luxurious lifestyle as well. So in Brazil, especially with respect to ownership structure, we've learned actually that there have been some recent studies based on this new data, and we learned that ownership structures matter a whole lot. So it turns out Brazil now has its very few new companies with a more dispersed shareholder base, and it turns out their managers are paid a whole lot more. We also find that boards that are packed with family members also have higher salaries. And of course, in the spirit of more comparative analysis and taking into account underlying distinctions when talking about policy prescriptions, of course, say on pay was a big issue in the US. Now it's the law. Brazil, I think I had this impression about Japan, although it was not entirely clear, but Brazil has a mandatory, a binding say on pay. Actually, shareholders need to approve the pay at each shareholders meeting. So we think, well, Brazil has wonderful corporate governance practices, but the question is, of course, so what? First, because we have controlling shareholders, so they approve sometimes their own pay or their elected person's pay. And second, I mean, even if you have important outside shareholders, you don't have the information really to make very informed decisions. Just before finishing, I just had two additional points. Because I think in two respects, the paper might not follow its purpose and its intended policy prescription of being very careful of using the US mindset elsewhere. And the first one, and at first I thought it was just an accident in the paper, but Rob repeated, so I'm going to bring it up, which is the link between pay and performance. So sometimes you say, now we have new information about the relationship between pay and performance in Japan. Well, I saw you ran regressions about the Tobin skewed, about the different types of boards, but other than that, I didn't find much new work on performance, the relationship between pay and performance in Japan. It seems like you were importing the lesson, say, founders' equity matters in the US, therefore it matters in Japan, but who knows, it might not matter. I mean, that was my impression. And the second point, it also relates to actually the design of the regulations, and in that, Rob anticipated and acknowledged the point, which is that, well, actually, I share your sympathies. I'm also a researcher, perhaps, and I also wanted to know more data. I'm very unhappy about the Brazilian status quo, but I think there is something very deep about the design of these new regulations in Japan. It seems that their concern is not so much the relationship between pay and performance, but rather the relationship between pay and inequality or the wage gap. I think it's very telling that they chose a threshold, and they don't want to know anything else. They only want to know things over and above the threshold. And that causes surprise because that's not the US mindset at all. But it seems to me that that's becoming really an important feature of the current governance debate, which is not being shaped that much by the US focus on performance. Today we are talking a lot about gender quotas. We probably we're not going to have that in the US because performance is really the key issue, but perhaps in other countries, corporate governance is being used increasingly to achieve other goals that are different from financial performance. It's also very telling that Brazil, a very unequal country, inequality was not an issue at all regarding those recent changes in the regulation. So thank you. I really, really enjoyed the paper.
I have a comment in this. You try to relate the corporate governance structure with the requirement of disclosure of the payment. If you can link, having a U.S. corporate governance and also a U.S. way to disclosure the amount paid for the executives. And have you asked them yourself why they are adopting this, since it is voluntary? Why I'm asking this? Because here in Brazil, when we think about why we're adopting some international standards in corporate governance, because we want the foreign money, not just of it, but since it is, may I adopt just part of the corporate governance, or should I adopt everything? So probably the companies that adopt the structure, for the board structure, will adopt also the disclosure requirement, because, you know, so I think the motive is important. So this is one comment. Another one is related with Brazilian experience in adopting this disclosure. Very, go to the judiciary to stop the new requirement by CVM. When you say this U.S. model, I think in the most of CVM ordinance or the motive, we find not a U.S. model, but an IOSCO requirement, an IOSCO principle. And then we can think about the local player trying to use a local institution to avoid these international standards. And when Mariana said about the judiciary probably saying watch or pay attention to the local problems like violence, but there is one interesting decision from the Rio de Janeiro judiciary power that's trying to visualize the international standards and the local regulation. Which one is better and why we are adopting this? So maybe in Japan, this kind of question or this kind of mentality is also important. I don't know which kind of companies adopt this or not. So I think it's an interesting question to address. That's it.
Jed? So yeah.
No, I just have another comment. Is, I have some data. For example, some companies may benefit themselves from the injunction, and when the times goes by, some of them choose to don't have the benefit from the injunction because the market punish this company that don't disclose. So it's not just a matter of it's obligatory or not. So there's market force too.
One of the things that struck me in the about the availability of the new information as far as any potential like self-selection bias is what were the characteristics of these firms prior to adopting these reforms, in the sense that they may have already had sort of like, as far as goes like foreign ownership, right, foreign management. Was there really like, can we establish a causal relationship between the adoption and these different outcomes if many of these characteristics or differentiations between Japanese firms pre-existed these types of these changes? Because when you talk about adopting reforms off the shelf, right, and the signaling effects, right, maybe it's not necessarily signaling so much as confirming pre-existing differences among Japanese firms prior to the ability to adopt this different type of different type of oversight. Because you point out like this idea of why would companies with more independent oversight need performance-sensitive pay. Well, maybe it's because the link isn't really causal in that sense. It was this pre-existing relationship. The second thing is just my curiosity as far as performance outcomes. I mean, just because the truth is, for a long time, Japan, and especially internal promotion, right, as opposed to outside hires, was a big way in which Japan was used as a counter model to the U.S. And even in the U.S. now, you have people like, I think, Ashish Nanda at Harvard Business School, people running these things is like, now we're actually have more empirical data about whether internal promotion really is actually a better way, right, for long-term value than engaging in all of these other types of discussions about pay for performance because it's complicated by this outside hire phenomenon, which is in itself really like a causal problem from that point of view. And this third sort of small thing is this issue of disclosure, which is, as Vilhena pointed out, is great for researchers, right? Also made me sort of curious is, with this change in Japan, is there any sort of use of compensation consultants in the same way that you have in the U.S.? In large part because some people consider them to be like a boogeyman or women when it comes to the executive compensation issue, and people are debating whether or not they have this effect. So it would be interesting again with whether or not this is a phenomenon in Japan and whether these disclosure possibilities make that industry something that was more possible than it was before.
So I really like that the tone of this paper, kind of like Curtis's last one, is trying to start out by descriptively understanding what's going on and then pointing at what the normative issues are, but recognizing it might be premature to answer those. And so kind of in that spirit, some of the things where descriptively I would have liked a little more depth is I think one of the things that was already raised was like the outside hire versus internal promotion and just fleshing out kind of the role that might be playing in some of the dynamics that you're seeing. And then two of the other ones is kind of going to the changes or the differences that you saw. One is I noticed that most of the incentive-based pay is in the form of bonuses rather than in the form of equity-based pay. And I'm trying to figure out whether or not those bonuses really are changing incentives or if it's just creating a different appearance. Because we know in the US, oftentimes you have bonuses. I mean, there's tax stories as well, but bonuses oftentimes are set in ways where instead it kind of creates a superficial appearance. And you can imagine a committee wanting to create the appearance without necessarily wanting it to change incentives all that much. So I don't know if it's available or not, but fleshing out whether the bonuses are actually having any effect. And related to that, I noticed that much of the decline came not from the base pay, but rather a decline in retirement pay. And of course, Rob, you've written on this before. I mean, is retirement pay there operating like creating a debt-based type incentive? Is it not? Are there tax implications associated with kind of having something in a retirement basket? So just kind of in those areas, those were things that I would like to see just flushed out a little bit.
Corporate governance elements are sometimes substitutes and sometimes they are complementary. And there are more reasons to believe that the final structure is endogenous to many elements in the firm than otherwise. So just to flesh a possibility that you touched as saying, once they have independent directors, why should they get the performance-based salary? You can think about it the other way around. That is to say, when you have a more knowledgeable, experienced, long-term directors, their ability to supervise management is much better. And once you replace them with independent ones, with shorter term, their ability to figure out how they are performing, they compensate for that by giving them more performance-based option instead of the other way around. So I would be more interested to know the relationship, for example, between the founder's ownership and the resulting pay, whether they are employing themselves when they employ outsiders. So because ownership is also an element of corporate governance that can compensate for other deficiencies in the structure. So I think that the most telling story here that gives a lot of ideas about how to think about it is the fact that Tobin's Q is about the same. That's I think can generate a lot of insight from this wonderful research.
I thought that one of the interesting results was that in the traditional firms that you didn't see as strong a relationship between firm size and compensation. And it's a little consistent, I think, with Zohar's comment a moment ago. You don't necessarily, if you're actually concerned about pay for performance, you don't necessarily want to see a close relationship between firm size and compensation because it creates an incentive to engage in negative net present value projects in order to make the firm larger. So it may suggest that there's, in fact, sensitivity to actually performance or return on capital in the traditional firms.
I'm Angela. I'm a researcher here at the University of Getúlio Vargas, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of São Paulo. I would like to ask a question and also make some comments. Did you see if there is a correlation between the companies with audit committees and board committees, companies that are cross-listed, they're listed abroad in the United States or the London Stock Exchange, because here, and the correlation between these cross-listed companies and the foreign directors, because here in Brazil we have this strong correlation between the audit companies that have audit committees and are cross-listed in the United States, for example. And also we have, for example, we have, I think, 20 to 30% of the companies that are listed, they are cross-listed in United States. So, and those companies have these audit committees. And about the relevance of the regulation that Professor Mariana told us, we finished a research recently, and another data that is interesting to mention is we researched 96 IPOs that were here in Brazil that that was made during the 2007 to 2012. And we saw since 2010, that was the mandatory disclosure of compensation here, the companies that made its IPOs made it with this disclosure. So maybe the companies that were already listed did not disclose, but the companies that were listed after that, starting to get best practices as soon as regulation gets stronger. That's a comment that you could, I don't know, could serve.
Thank you very much. These are extremely helpful comments. I'm an empirical guy, so I want to tell you I have 20 comments. And I don't think I'll respond effectively to all of them, but I'll try. First of all, let me start by thanking Mariana for very, very helpful comments. I think you are absolutely right. The thrust of the paper is along the lines of a cautionary tale about importing governance practices into different institutional contexts. I do want to just highlight 2 or 3 points that I don't think were informationally were as clear as they could be in the paper, and just knowing that is helpful. First, we do have controls for ownership structure. We rely mostly on controls related to bank ownership because there are reasons in the Japan institutional context I think that's the important metric. But I didn't mean when I listed that in the appendix to say that we exclude it. We also control for other things. We just use the model that includes the bank ownership because we think that's the better model for the Japanese context. Also, you said something about the pay-performance relationship. You said, well, look, in the U.S., maybe ownership leads to better pay for performance, but we shouldn't import that lesson into other contexts. I don't think that's what we're doing, although we need to clarify this. We're making an assumption, though, that I need to say more about. The assumption we're making is that ex ante, if an executive owns a significant stake in the firm, it follows that they have a stronger pay for performance relationship than someone who doesn't. Why? Because their personal wealth is meaningfully tied to the value of the firm just by dint of their stock ownership. That's not an assumption about institutional context or governance practice. That's just ex ante true. But I think your point is ex post it's far from true, and that gets to a comment that Jed asked. And every time I present a paper like this, somebody says to me, so what is the relationship between pay and performance? Like, do you see a relationship between pay and performance? And the answer, I've done a half dozen of these papers. I have never seen an analysis that satisfies me that these contractual arrangements ex ante are associated with better performance ex post. The models that do this right, that control for the right differences, just don't find robust results. That doesn't mean, of course, we shouldn't care about it. It just means that the evidence hasn't yet given an answer to your question. It's fascinating to hear a little bit about what happened in Brazil. So I knew that they'd adopted the minimum and maximum thresholds and then the average in between. And I knew they were thinking about individualized disclosure, but I had no idea about the kidnapping rationale for not adopting that. Maybe one way the paper can be helpful, and this is a useful conversation because the paper's being published in 4 months, but we have time to make changes, is we can say a little bit about why in the end Japan didn't find these. And again, as you say, maybe there are differences that are are relevant, but you're right to say that we should be careful about opportunists using this be careful analysis as a reason not to do important regulatory changes. Oh, another comment Mariana made is very helpful and important. I want to see if you're satisfied with my answer. So you said this foreigner difference we see might just be a new hire difference. And Mariana pointed out quite rightly that the literature in the US and elsewhere establishes that new hires tend to get paid more and to have a stronger pay-for-performance link. So it could just be that we're seeing that. That's absolutely right, but I'm lucky in the sample, which is that because I have executives with very long tenure. The executive in my sample who's got the shortest tenure in her company has been there 5 years. And the US literature suggests that this effect goes away over time, once an executive has their contract renewed. So I think what I would do to address your concern, we're control for tenure, is I'll say something about that possibility, and maybe that we have reason to believe, because of the tenure dynamics in this particular sample, that that's not a problem, but that's a very good point. I know we're limited to time, but I just want to answer one more comment that was raised, and it was yours. You said, oh, and I should clarify, by the way, the disclosure regime is not voluntary. The governance choice is voluntary. You can choose the independent committee or not. But if you pay someone more than 100 million yen, it's not voluntary. You've got to disclose this person's pay. And you've got to disclose not only how much they make, but the breakdown, options, salary, et cetera. And one thing that's funny is somebody hinted that maybe the companies would game it. So you thought, like, maybe if you had someone who was about to make 100 million yen, you might draw them back over the line so you don't end up in this disclosure regime. We did some work with the subsequent data to see whether that happened, and the data don't support that possibility. But you raised a possibility that's very interesting, which is maybe some firms in Brazil would just voluntarily disclose the individualized amounts because they want to send the kinds of signal we've been talking about. And actually, that in the U.S. that was true. So before the U.S. SEC mandated executive comp disclosures, there were some firms that voluntarily disclosed it. Now, there are long-established reasons that Professor Fox and others have written about why voluntary disclosure by itself wouldn't solve all the governance problems associated with public companies. But what's interesting about what you've said is in the U.S. we just passed a new law called the Jobs Act. I don't know if anyone's heard of this law. What it says is that certain companies that are coming public have a choice. When they come public, they can say, hey, that whole executive compensation disclosure thing, we don't want to do it. And if they're a certain small-sized company in the U.S., the Jobs Act allows them for 5 years not to have to disclose their executives' pay. I'm working on a separate paper now that examines whether or not companies actually take advantage of this ability not to disclose their executives' pay. The preliminary result is that they don't. They voluntarily they disclose it anyway, even though U.S. law doesn't make them. But all very interesting comments that we'll incorporate into the paper, so thank you very much.
Can I say just one thing briefly on, Verna, you made a very insightful point with respect to the, you said the design of the Japanese system may show a different mindset, and that's absolutely right. You mentioned it may reflect concern over pay gap as opposed to pay for performance, and that is absolutely what drove this, the adoption of this disclosure regime. There was a labor-oriented government that came to power in Japan, very close to trade unions and the like, and they basically took advantage of the uproar in the United States over exorbitant executive compensation and used it to ram through this this disclosure obligation, even though exorbitant pay in Japan, I mean, that's not the problem with executive compensation in Japan. So you're absolutely right. The 100 million is arbitrary, but it seems aimed at some sort of the idea of average compensation in the United States. They basically just took a convenient number, but they used it to get at this supposed, alarming pay gap in Japan. So you're absolutely on point with that, and I think we should say more about that because it's pretty revealing of a very different mindset.
Just very briefly, Curtis is really right about that, and one reason why it's a useful point for us to add to the paper before we publish it is that in the U.S. right now there's an increasing sense that securities laws are being used, as you suggested, to achieve other goals, right? We have a new rule, for example, that requires disclosure of the ratio between the CEO's pay and the median worker's pay in the company. You can say maybe this is useful for investors, but I think a lot of people think maybe not. It's got another goal in mind. We have disclosure now of whether companies are investing in countries that use conflict, that have conflict minerals exposure. Gender diversity. There's a crazy group of professors who asked the SEC to disclose public companies' political spending. So there's all kinds of ways in which the securities laws are being used in this way, and it's an interesting debate that we don't connect to in the paper, and we really need to, so we will.
Just the this conversation reminds me of when I visited Curtis first in New York, maybe 4 years ago. And we were chatting, and then Curtis told me, well, you see that guy in the end of the corridor? I was just talking to him, it was some Japanese person, and he was just telling me how it might turn out to be embarrassing to make public executive compensation in Japan for the executives, for the reason that they don't make much more than their, the people they're bossing, so that they're afraid that that will diminish incentives for the people to, basically work so hard to climb up in the hierarchy. Like, you look at the different rationales. I mean, here we're concerned about, we invoke privacy laws because we're concerned with violence and security, and I don't see it quite as Mariana does, in the sense that I don't see it as capture. I think it's really a legitimate argument, and I would rule, if I were the judge, I would say it's unconstitutional to make pay public, given our circumstances, and given that just making pay public is something that to begin with. Well, I mean, it's, we can debate that. I mean, I'm quite happy, that they weren't kidnapped, but
if this lobby's so powerful, I like your chances of being pointed to the Constitutional Court. This is
right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, in any case, like the rationales are so different, right? This is you might not buy it, but it's still a reasonable argument here. And it's not a reasonable argument in Japan, but the argument that this person made, that perhaps, showing to the public and to the employees that the pay difference is so small can kill incentives to work hard, that's like a crazy argument for us, and it seems to be reasonable in Japan. So I'd like to thank Rob for this great paper and engaging presentation. Same for Mariana. And then we should quickly break for coffee for 10 minutes.